To begin my show and tell edit, I'm going to bring the 3 clips that make up the base of my presentation into the timeline, where I've got a new 1920 by 1080 30 FPS sequence ready to go. You'll see that I already went through each of these clips and placed in and out points, so I can bring in just those sections I intend to use. Remember that you can also trim stuff down in the timeline by using either the selection tool or the razor tool. Markers can also be added to clips in the timeline by pressing the M key. Just make sure you've got the right clip selected first. I'll line up my presentation clips, then I'll go ahead and go into the effects panel and click and drag to add some cross-dissolve transitions to the beginning of the first clip and the end of the third. Not absolutely necessary, but I think they tend to bookend a video better than just a hard start or stop. Next, I'm going to jump about a minute 15 into my sequence, to the point where I mentioned the video game that my shield's design came from. You'll see that on my first clip, I've already got a marker placed at the point where I want the piece of game art to fade in. So I'll drag the image into the second video track and line it up with the marker. If your clips aren't snapping into place like you see my image doing with these markers, you'll want to make sure that the Snap in Timeline function is active. That's that magnet-shaped icon on the left side of the panel, which should be blue. When I drag the game art into the timeline, you'll see that there's actually more to the image than the chunk displayed in my sample video. Before I start messing around with its scale or position, I'm going to want to crop it down a bit. So far, we've only gone into the effects panel to grab video transitions. But a lot of these effects are meant to be applied to the entirety of a clip and not just the ends. The effects panel's got a little search bar into which I'll type crop, which will reveal an effect with the same name listed under video effects. I'll click and drag that onto my image, and then with my image selected, I can go to the effect controls panel and scroll down, and you'll see that the crop effects controls have been added. It's got its own masking functions, but what I'm interested in are the controls a little further down. Each of these 4 percentages defines the amount by which the image is cropped from that side. If I click and drag the value next to bottom and increase it, the bottom of the image starts to disappear. I'm only worried about bringing in the left and right sides though, so I'm going to increase each of their values to about 30%. Below these percentage controls, there's a checkbox marked Zoom. If I check that box, Premiere will take the visible portion of the image and stretch it to fit the frame size as determined by the sequence. I don't need that though, so I'll leave it unchecked. This last function is called Edge Feather, and by increasing its value, I can fade out the edges of my image a bit and soften them up. I'm going to set it to -45 because I just think it looks nice. Now, to get into some keyframes, I'll scroll back up to the top of the Effect Controls panel. I'm going to adjust this image's position values to slide it to the left of the frame. If you're thinking in terms of the rule of thirds, I'm looking to place the image along the left vertical line. To create the subtle expanding effect from the sample video, I'll start by bringing the Effect Controls playhead to the start of the clip and setting a keyframe. I could set the image's scale to start at 100%, but I think that's a bit too small to start, so I'll activate the scale stopwatch and enter a new value of 115 and hit enter to set the keyframe. Before I set the second keyframe, I'll go back to the main timeline and take the selection tool to extend the image to a length of about 7 seconds. Back in Effect Controls, I'll move the playhead to the right and click on the scale value, type in a higher value, 130 in this case, and hit enter to create the second keyframe. I could leave it there, but I want the animation to persist the whole time the image is on screen. To accomplish that, I'll click and drag the keyframe all the way to the end of the mini timeline. Remember, the Effect Controls timeline is based on the clip currently selected. Let's say you have a clip with a duration of 1 minute, 30 seconds, and 10 frames. You create an animation that ends on the very last frame. If that clip starts at the very beginning of the sequence, that animation will end at 1 minute, 30 seconds, and 10 frames. If you were to move the clip 10 seconds forward in the main timeline, the animation would instead end at 1 minute, 40 seconds, and 10 frames. So, with that animation sorted, I'll go ahead and drop a couple cross dissolves on the image so it fades in and out in addition to expanding. You'll see those transitions are represented in the effect controls timeline as well. I could accomplish a similar effect with the cross dissolves by using keyframes on the opacity controls, but for our purposes, applying and modifying a preset transition will do the trick. There's not much to say about my next clip. It gets trimmed down to fit the narration without any additional keyframes. The clip after that's a bit different, however. This other clip was taken directly from my Nintendo Switch using its built-in screen capture function, and transferred by means of its QR system. You'll notice though that the clip looks a little bit small when brought into the timeline. That's because the console records snapshots and clips at a lower resolution than what I've set for this sequence. The clip's native resolution is 1280 by 720, so to make it fit, I'll need to increase its scale by 50%. I'm not limited to just making the clip fit, however. In fact, I want to take advantage of the effect controls to add a little bit to its presentation. So I'm actually going to increase its scale to 200%, and I'm going to add a pair of position keyframes to have the clip slide from right to left. By doing so, I can better highlight the shields on screen while also adding a bit of movement to what would have effectively been a static video clip. For the step-by-step prop build explanation, you can see I'm starting with a set of 6 images. I actually took these in reverse order, starting with all the materials sitting on the disc, snapping a picture, removing something, snapping another picture, and so on. That way, I cut down on the risk that I might bump into something, like I might have done if I was placing the items before each photo. I'll start by bringing the first photo into the timeline and using the selection tool to position it and stretch it to the proper length. Checking the program panel, however, you'll see that similar to the game clip, the photo doesn't quite fit the frame. The dimensions of these photos are actually 6000 by 3375. Had I taken them at 1080, I would have just been scaling them up to achieve a similar composition. Taking these photos at a higher resolution means I can scale them up and keep them looking crisp. I'd still generally advise you stick close to 1920 by 1080, but high-resolution image files aren't as likely to slow you down as much as working with high-resolution video might. Next, I'm going into the effect controls to adjust its position and place the lower half of the disc in the center of the frame. Then, I'll set a couple of scale keyframes like I did for the previous images. Since nothing should have moved much between photos, I can use this first image to determine the framing I want this sequence to start and end at, and then set position and scale keyframes accordingly. In this sense, keyframe animations can be thought of as writing instructions for virtual camera movements. Now that I've got those keyframes set, I'll bring in my remaining photos and stack them on top of the first photo in the video tracks above it. Sequences like this only have 3 video tracks by default, but if you drag a clip past the topmost track, or bottommost track when working with audio, a new track will be added to accommodate it. Rather than manually recreating those keyframes for each photo, I can copy and paste them from the first photo. First, I'll right-click the first photo and select Copy. Then, I'll select the remaining photos by either holding Shift and clicking each of them, or by clicking and dragging with the selection tool to create a box that passes through all of them. Then, with the remaining 5 photos highlighted, I'll right-click on one of them and select Paste Attributes. The window that appears gives me options of which attributes, keyframed or otherwise, I want to apply to the selected clips. Position and scale both fall under motion, so that's the only checkbox I need to worry about selecting before I hit OK. The fact that you can select and deselect certain attributes in this menu means that copying attributes isn't an all or nothing deal, which can be super convenient. There's also an option for Scale Attribute Times, which lets you apply keyframe timings proportionally onto a clip of a different length. I actually just learned about that while writing this script. Now with each photo keyframed to match the others, I can start trimming them down to match my narration. This actually would be a very good place to have already set markers to indicate where I want to make these transitions, but it shouldn't take too much more time.
Next, I found a good image and used Photoshop to lay a grid over it for reference. Then I traced the grid onto one of the discs and used it to guide me as I copied out the pattern from the image square by square.
The way I've done it, the timing of the keyframes won't change as I trim down each of the photos. They would if I moved the entire clip, but trimming or extending the end of a clip won't affect the other keyframes. All of this together creates the illusion of the items popping into existence while I talk and move the camera, which is a lot more dynamic and interesting to watch than it would have been if I had just had the photos fit the frame exactly and just cut between each of them with no movement. One last video technique before getting into some audio editing. After my step-by-step explanation, my sample video transitions to a sort of handheld glamour shot of the shield, but my clip wasn't actually long enough to fill the time I needed. I wanted the camera to keep moving, but I'd need another second or two of footage. I know at least two ways I could achieve a similar effect. Both methods involve right-clicking on the clip and selecting Speed/Duration. One way would be to find a place in the clip to start playing it backwards. For instance, I could find a point shortly before it cuts off and use the razor tool to split the clip there. Then I could right-click on the newly segmented part on the right, select Speed/Duration, and mark Reverse Speed. The transition as it would stand then doesn't necessarily work because the starting and ending points of the second part have obviously been flipped. What I'll do is drag it into the track above the first part of the clip and line up their starting points. Now I'll use the selection tool to extend the reversed clip to roughly the same length and then put them back next to each other. And as you can see, there's a bit of a jump in there, but it's serviceable. Alternatively, because I only need a little bit more footage, I could actually set it to play at a fraction of the speed, not so much that it's particularly noticeable, but just enough. To figure out my target duration, I'll grab one of my image files and drag it over top of my little glamour shot. Once I figure out the point where I want the modified clip to end, I'll just stretch my image file to that same length, then hover my cursor over the image and see what the duration is. Then I can get rid of the image, right-click on my clip, select Speed and Duration, and type in that target duration. Premiere will then change the playback speed to match that duration. I'm trying to get a roughly 7-second clip to cover span a little closer to 9 seconds, so Premiere will do the math and set the clip to play at approximately 80% speed. This ratio actually works out to essentially run the clip at 24 frames per second rather than 30. But you've got to be careful when slowing down clips this way. Slow it down too much and it'll start to look choppy and break the illusion of movement. That said, these last two techniques really are more patch job techniques. It was just a case where I didn't have quite enough footage and I didn't have the time to go and set everything up again. But with that, let's move on to some audio editing.